Hello, viewers. This is your host Dhiren Mehta from the Global Perspectives. As we all know, the mainstream media today is controlled by large corporates and lobbyists serving to special interest groups. And because of that, most of the coverage in mainstream media is serving to specific narrative built on a selective and twisted facts and biased stories. We are a new age crowdsourced reporting medium that aims to bring alternate perspectives on the issue of global relevance that too need to be heard. We are committed to make honest efforts to bring to you the perspectives of the opinion makers whose perspectives are often not well presented in mainstream media. In our last program on May 17th, we talked about the coronavirus related pandemic that has devastated across the world. And in that program, we talked about the origins of the virus, how the World Health Organizations in various countries managed the pandemic, and we also briefly talked about politics. Today, in our program, we will discuss on the aftermath of the pandemic with specifically focusing on the need for restructuring the World Health Organizations and with specific focus on the World Health Organization. We'll also talk about the need for forming new alliances worldwide to deal with the new threats the world is facing, the new realities of today, and how the old alliances need to be restructured. Today in our program, we have Arif Aajakia. He is a human rights defender. He has been attending the Human Rights Council in Geneva since 1995. And every year he has been spending nearly 10 weeks contributing to the Human Rights Council as well as for the human rights related advocacy. He was also a mayor of one of the town of Karachi in Pakistan from 2005 to 2007. We have David Vance. He is a well-known author and founder of Alt News Media. He is very well known on the social media as well with over 200,000 followers. David is very critical of how UK has managed the pandemic, and also he has a very strong views about the World Health Organization. So we'll hear his perspective on that as well. We also have on our panel Francios Gautier. Francios Gautier is a journalist with about 35 years of career in journalism. He is primarily focused on Southeast Asia and China from coverage standpoint. He is also the chief editor of one of the French magazine. His special focus has been the Indo-China relation, Indo-Pak relation, and the affairs of South Asia. He is also very much interested in the world politics and has written several books on that. And we also have Ravi Batra. Ravi is an attorney based out of New York, representing governments, individuals, and corporates. Ravi is chair for the National Advisory Council for South Asia. He is also a COVID survivor. And Ravi represents the Ukrainian mission in United Nations from a legal advice standpoint. So, welcome panelists. Thank you so much. So, welcome back, viewers, and we'll start with opening statement from all. So, Arif, you are joining us for the first time, and we'll go in alphabetical order, anyways. So, Arif, over to you. What would you like to say? And let's hear from all the panelists before we get into the program. Thanks.
As we have confined the topic only to WHO, although we cannot separate WHO from UN systems, WHO is a sub-body of UN, and it runs, all the UN bodies run with the same pattern. A country like New Zealand with 50 million people population has one vote, and a country like China or India, more than 1 billion people, one vote. So if we want to bring a change in WHO, we have to bring change in entire system, because the system has collapsed. The WHO has failed. This is a pandemic. This was responsibility of WHO, but WHO is a politicized organization now. When we appoint director of WHO by China, and then China has a support of OIC countries and some African countries who are under the debt of China. So to bring a change in WHO, it is not the correct time, of course, because we are during a pandemic. But once we are out of this pandemic, there is a certain need of overhauling of WHO. There has to be an effective change in WHO because it has failed. And this pandemic has shocked the world. So I think that it is there is an urgent need, because some countries who are financing entire activities of WHO, and they have very less say in the affairs of WHO. So there is a need of change in the basic system of the WHO. Billions of dollars are spent on WHO, and the result we can see how it has happened. It is the strong social system and healthcare systems of Europe and America that they have sustained until now Corona. If it was a country like Pakistan or other third world country, the result would have been devastating. So I think that yes, world has to come together for a big change in WHO and other UN systems, because it is not the only pandemic that we are facing. It came maybe after 100 years, but now we have a fear that there will be regular viruses and different kind of things. And then the conspiracy theories that somebody has, maybe it is a criminal negligence. It is a negligence, this is sure. But now it is a criminal negligence or just like this. If it is a criminal negligence, means there is something behind. So all these things, we need a very strong international body to look after the health affairs of entire world.
Okay.
Thank you so much. David, you want to go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Arif just said. I maybe sort of, my own view is that the World Health Organization is essentially a subsidiary of the Chinese Communist Party these days. And that's one of the things that I find most offensive about it. I also ask myself, how can it be that the World Health Organization has, sitting at the top of it, an Ethiopian Marxist in the form of Dr. Tedros? I find these things really quite interesting. And they lead me to the conclusion, and again, in agreement with Arif, that the World Health Organization is not fit for purpose as it exists at the moment. And I'm sure other panelists will further elaborate on this. But at the very least, we need fundamental root and branch reform to see if it can be made to work. I have to say, I'm not someone who particularly believes that what we need is more globalism and more globalist organizations, but you know, it's where it is, and I guess we have to be realistic. However, the way in which the WHO has colluded with the Chinese Communist Party, most particularly on the 14th of January this year, when the WHO tweeted out that it believed, based on what the Chinese authorities were telling it, that there was no human-to-human transmission of the coronavirus. So look, there you have January 14th, WHO condemned by its own words because it was very happy to believe the CCP. The consequences are measured in the deaths potentially of hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. So look, the World Health Organization really just can't carry on, and it's not good enough, you know, just to sort of talk about mild reform. This is an organization headed up by a Marxist, funded actually, curiously, by the likes of the UK. My country is the second biggest donor after the US to the WHO. China gets away with paying hardly any money, even though it essentially owns it. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. So, like, to summarize my position, I'm incredibly cynical about the WHO. I think it is an argument for saying Dr. Tedros should be standing in the dock at the Hague for his collusion with the Chinese Communist Party. So we do need to see change, and I'm sure we'll discuss what that change might look like.
Thank you so much, David. Francois, do you want to go?
Well, I don't have much to say, actually, because my fellow speakers have, said the essential. Only thing I would like to say is that today we're talking about the aftermath of the coronavirus, and definitely there are going to be some big changes, and the UN, the UNESCO, the World Health Organizations, have lost a lot of credibility. I'm glad the United States is one of the countries that have the courage to say things as they are, that these bodies have become bureaucratic. They're dominated by, countries which are not necessarily democratic, which have agendas. So I am waiting for these changes. I'm waiting for the world, to say, we need something new. And these institutions have failed us. It's the UN, actually. I mean, more than the World Health Organization. It's the UN which has failed us for a long time, So today we should discuss about, the post-coronavirus, what's going to happen, the great changes that are going to happen in the world, the key nations. And I believe that China, United States, India, even Tibet today I would like to say a few words about Tibet. These are going to be the key players in the world. Thank you.
Thanks. And Ravi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Darren. First, I want to welcome Arif to the group. And you mentioned, Darren, that he was mayor of one of the towns near or around Karachi. And one of my dear friends, when he was here as Pakistan's ambassador to the UN, Hussain Haroon, he was the speaker of the Sindh Assembly. So, hi, Arif. And I certainly want to join this fan club of WHO as a very strong member of that fan club, because I find the WHO has literally destroyed its credibility that it's built from beginning. And it's a very important organization. But what has occurred during the coronavirus event, they have proven that they cannot be trusted given the current leadership and the current structure. And the fact that India just took over the chairmanship of the WHO body, while it may sound salutary, and it is salutary to some extent, because India is suffering from coronavirus. So if you're a victim, you're much more in tune to the needs to correct the problem. But let's back up for a minute from the WHO. And I want to say, if it wasn't for President Trump, and I say this as Democrat, and the fact that we have one leader at a time, that's a very important principle. And President Trump has taken on China on many fronts, even while he was campaigning. And then, of course, the coronavirus came along. And from my perspective, China is responsible, without question, for negligence in how it behaved with the coronavirus in China. It is certainly responsible for exporting the virus by allowing people from Wuhan that it knew as a group were infected. Maybe not everyone that was infected, but as a group they knew that who was infected, and allowing that export and having the West economy essentially collapse. This has, and then for WHO to stay asleep so that the leadership of the world, which relies upon them as forensic cops, medical cops, to sound the alarm. As David said, until January 14th, they were saying there was no human-to-human transmission, when China knew from December 1, 2019, with patient 0, that that's not true. And WHO would have known if they had bothered to look. They just kept their eyes closed, and they carried on whatever the Chinese official policy was. My concern, as we move forward from last show to this show, is what has changed. Well, United States is now blocking Chinese companies from being listed on the stock exchange. Very important. Aside from defunding WHO or suspending the funding of WHO, and President Trump has made the point. Maybe we should all be developing countries, which is what David was saying. United States, pays the most. Next is UK, and how come China pays little? Because they're in the developing country category. So they get a huge discount. Anyone with a developing country category in the UN system, you get a discount. So and that's a discount that's no longer valid. Most troubling for me, however, is is President Xi's policy of rejuvenating China. And that word rejuvenating is referring back to the Ming Dynasty. And if you look back at what China is doing, if I bump into you, I'll say sorry. If my car hits yours, I'll say sorry. I don't become belligerent. China's become belligerent after having done this. So something is odd. And it raises a very serious question.
Very, very interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah. So it raised the question for me, was this export accidental, really? Or was it part of a plan? And so to me, there is a real open question whether we were Pearl Harbor, the West and the United States, because it's part of China's plan of rejuvenating the Ming Dynasty and creating a tributary vassal state system, which it enjoyed. Francois, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about India because I live in India. China has become very belligerent, not only in Hong Kong, we know what's happening in Hong Kong, but in India, they're challenging the Indian soldiers, they're crossing, in Ladakh. So there is a planned belligerence on the part of China, whether they're trying to, make us forget about where the coronavirus originated, or whether they think that now is a good time to implement, very hostile decisions and very hostile moves. I don't know, but what you said is very, very interesting. Why is China very belligerent at the moment? What is the reasoning behind that?
Well, I consider this move. I consider this move to be part of a larger plan. 10 years or so ago, they started with building up Mischief Reef. They bought the carrier ship from Ukraine as scrap metal under false pretenses, when in fact they were using it to re-engineer their ability to build a carrier ship in China, and which they have now created such a carrier ship. So I don't think OBOR and AAIB are part of the same thing. You cannot have one belt, one road without a bank that funds it. So both were created at the same time, and this has been going on for 10 years. And I was troubled by it on a political level, but not very concerned. Now I'm very concerned because the coronavirus export is actually, if you look at it, not as an accident, but as part of an overarching plan. Because China is a managed economy, is a managed policy. They don't work on 90-day results. They work on a 25-year plan, 100-year plan. And each president of the United States, when they leave a memo for their successor. Well, China, their chairman has their own chosen successor. It's not elected, it's chosen. So each one is actually told what the game plan is. So when Chairman Mao left, and I was in Hong Kong when I was 11 years old, when Mao Zedong's Red Chinese Guards were walking the streets of Hong Kong in 1967. So, and then at the same time, in 1967, China turned to the United States and made an agreement with then candidate Richard Nixon, which then led to the Nixon, a very famous China policy article in the Foreign Affairs. So I see this as a continuum, and not something that's episodic. And I think if we ought to give China credit for being smart. We ought to give China credit for being brilliant. We ought to give China credit for being careful and methodical and a great planner. To think of them in any other way, I think.
I want to come in this one. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can certainly give them credit, but I think we also need to castigate them in exactly the same way, because they are an authoritarian, totalitarian, evil empire, as far as I'm concerned. But you are right, Ravi. You mentioned two things I want to say. You mentioned their Pearl Harboring of essentially the world. I completely, that's a great expression. Essentially, for whatever reason, and we don't know exactly how it got out, but the net result is this: most economies across the world, all major economies, are now dramatically weakened. And guess what the financial press are now saying? Yeah, China are moving in, buying up companies for a very cheap price wherever they can get them, right across the globe. So that's a very fortunate coincidence, isn't it? And the second thing, and the final point in this is, Ravi, to go back to you as well, that the Chinese think in terms of centuries. So, whereas the nature of most Western democracies, we think in terms of, a presidential cycle, 4 or 5 years. So they've got a massive advantage over us because of that approach. So they've made it clear China has one aim: by 2045 to become the global superpower. And you'd have to say that coronavirus has really facilitated them in that regard. So, we need to think smarter. We need to think much more strategically. And we need to all unite, I think, around the world to fight, to stand up for the values of liberty, freedom, and all the rest of it, which the Chinese are not remotely interested in.
Thanks for the opening statement. Welcome back, viewers, in our first segment. In this segment, we are going to talk about the need to reorganize and restructure the world organizations. And today we'll specifically focus on WHO, which is, of course, at the center of controversy right now because of the pandemic. And we may touch upon maybe UN, which is because WHO being the subsidiary of UN. So, David, coming to you, recently you tweeted about declaring China as a terrorist country, and that was pretty extreme to talk about, declaring China as terrorist country and even ban China from a UN Security Council. So can you share your thoughts to our viewers, what you mean to say?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure why that's controversial. I mean, China is a country which has got millions of Uyghur Muslims locked up in concentration camps. I'm not sure that's the sign of a civilized country. China is a country which allegedly conducts experiments on live human beings in terms of organ harvesting. That doesn't sound very civilized to me. And to go back to a point which we'd made in the first part of this conversation, China is a country which some may feel has indeed Pearl Harbored the world, economically speaking. So all these things make me conclude that China is a country which needs to be, never mind the rest of us having to self-isolate and social distance, China needs to be isolated from the rest of the world until such times as it learns to behave itself a little bit better and not, for example, put forward global plagues. That'd be a good start. So, the Chinese only understand one thing. They understand measured force. And one way we can do that is we can economically in particular, we need to isolate them. Japan in the last week or so has come out with some interesting statements about encouraging Japanese companies to bring manufacturing back to Japan out of China. And I think President Trump has talked about this as well. All of us, we need to do this. We need to bring the supply chains back from China. That will teach the Chinese a lesson. And if we can minimize their influence, which is a very, in my view, a toxic influence across the world, particularly in underdeveloped countries like Africa, where they're buying them up, they're manipulating them, and it's not going to end well, then that's all for the better. So I know it's not the most diplomatic way of putting it. I do understand that. But then I'm not sure where's the diplomacy in concentration camps. Where's the diplomacy in organ harvesting and living human beings? And where's the diplomacy in potentially exporting plagues around the world? No, China needs to be brought to heel, and we only can do that if we work together.
Thank you. And you mentioned about not a diplomatic way of putting, but on our platform, we call ourselves invincible. Invincible means we will not mince our words.
I tend not to.
And we are invincible, so we will not be defeated. So we are invincible. We will not mince our words. We say the truth, and truth may be bitter.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So Arif, you initially mentioned, right, that the country that pays more has more say in the world organizations like WHO and other UN bodies. But here we see something contradictory, right? China has hardly contributed to, in fact, their share, if you look at it in the UN, is not even on top 10. But they have so much of control over UN, they have so much of control over World Health Organization, and also other bodies like Human Rights Council, etc. So why these contradictions and why this paradox, right, given specifically to China's case?
Well, before coming to that point, I would like to add something to Ravi and David's statements. We are complaining that China is controlling international organizations, international markets, poor countries. But who is responsible? Were Europeans and Americans sleeping? We started WTO, World Trade Organization, and we were happy that now McDonald's is everywhere, Starbucks is everywhere. But we did not stop China. China took the real benefit of WTO. I was living in Brussels. I had a garment shop. I used to go every week to Paris to buy garments. In Paris garments market, there was no Chinese in 90s. But in early 2000, half of the market was controlled by Chinese. So we allowed China to enter the world and overcome. And we kept quiet. We never stopped China. Today we are realizing that the international organizations are occupied by China. It is not occupied by today. It is occupied since decades now. Yeah. OIC, African countries, these votes are very important for China. And China manipulates UN systems without paying any contribution to the running of UN bodies. So it is our responsibility. Now, for example, I will ask Ravi that when WTO started and Apple company, Amazon, they all rushed with their finance to China. They made their companies, their factories, their everything there. They did not know that China is a country who does not allow freedom of faith. China is a country that does not allow freedom of speech. Falun Gong is a sect which is killed. The genocide of Falun Gong people is going on in China. Not from now, since decades. Tibet is occupied. Sikkim is occupied. Hong Kong is occupied. All these, and the world is sleeping. Suddenly we today realize that China is taking everything. What were we doing? These European and American think tanks have a policy of 50 years in advance. We did not see China is making a CPEC. China is making alliances. China is taking control of small economic markets. We never paid attention to this, and now today suddenly when we start complaining that China is controlling, who allowed Chinese to control all this? It is all our fault that we kept our eyes closed on the human rights record of China. European governments have human rights as a cornerstone of their foreign policy. But they kept ignoring Pakistan, China, that alliance. The worst human rights records are of Pakistan and China in this world. Pakistan is the only army of the world which has committed genocide of its own people again and again. Bengalis in early 70s, Baloch from early 70s till now, Sindhis in 70s, 90s, Muhajirs, and Pakhtuns are going on since 20 years. We never do anything against Pakistan. But when it comes to India, immediately we realize that in India there are human rights violations. So we have to understand that all this is happening because China has taken control of these international organizations. Now WHO is totally corrupt organization, corrupt in not in a mean of financial corruption, I want to say. Corrupt in a mean that China has taken control of WHO not from today, not from this month, but since years. So it is our responsibility now to bring a change in entire system.
May I answer?
Yes,
and I know Francois wants to get in also, so I'll just keep my comments to 2 to 3 minutes. One, I want to go back to when we were ending the opening statements. David, when I was saying that we ought not to underestimate China, and we ought to acknowledge its brilliance in its planning, its development, its methodological way of continuing. I was simply connecting the dots because Chairman Mao, in 1949, when China was created, PRC was created, was a wartime leader. Okay, he had fought with the Japanese Imperial Army from 1931 all the way past World War II. So there is something to be said for Chairman Mao understanding the art of war. And this is the beginning of China. And if you start from 1949 and the 1949 Karachi Agreement between Pakistan and China, which frankly, before Israel realized the importance of strategic Golan Heights in war, China understood that. So China has been making itself war immune from 1949. So the South China Sea, the East China Sea, these are all part of the same dots that are connecting over decades. My point, and I wrote a letter to President Trump, and I'm telling you with great delight, he has adopted my Pearl Harbor point. I wrote a letter to him on April 14th, and my point is that I don't think we should look at coronavirus as a standalone. We ought to see this as something that is part of a long planned event, which brings the Western economies to its knees, which it has. Not to mention, we are now passing more people infected and more people dying than many wars or most wars. So we ought to look at China. And you know, even an evil genius is still a genius. Okay, that's what I'm talking to, David. I don't want to make the mistake which the West makes all the time, because we look at China as if we're looking in the mirror. They're not us. Okay. They everything they do is digested well, thought out well, and minor turbulences don't change the course of conduct for them. And which is why they can stick to a 25-year, 50-year, 100-year plan. So I would simply say to you that we ought to give China the respect it deserves for its thinking. We may completely disagree with it, but we have to acknowledge that they've thought it out. They're not a Hitler. They're Hitler on steroids. Okay, a Hitler is a dwarf compared to China. Okay. So the issue of the incarceration of the Muslims in China, you know, is the concentration camps of Hitler. But that's not the point. We have to give them, we need to connect the dots. Even the war that they've got that Francois was talking about, the clash in Ladakh, that is to warn India to be careful being America's partner in the Indian Ocean and not to do joint freedom of navigation trips. That's what that's about, okay? And thank God India is not backing away from being now America's best friend, because we need India to be America's best friend.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, sorry, I just want to come back on that. I agree again, Ravi. I think we see it the same. I guess my only sort of concern is China can think like that because it's not a democracy and because their little tyrannical leaders don't have to run an election every 5 years. Elections don't matter. So it's it's one of these strange paradigms that regimes like China have got a strategic advantage over democracies because
Absolutely.
and it's very difficult to deal with, and I guess that's why we do need to be much more clever and much more strategic in how we cope with it.
So, David, I'll come back to that point. You made a great point, and Arif, you also made a very good point about how China has been strategically doing it for last almost 50 years now. But before we do that, Francois, you wanted to share something. And in your opening statement, you talked about that you want to talk about China's, how it has been doing strategically, starting with Tibet and, also their influence on the UN. So can you go and share your perspective?
Yeah, but to continue what David and Ravi said, we do not want to do black and white, evil and good. I'm a great lover of Western classical music, and the other day I was listening to old Chinese concert, of Mozart, and such, such refinement, such, high level of, understanding of the Western music, by a country which is so far away from, this type of culture. So we have to give credit to the Chinese. Nevertheless, living in India, and being a political journalist, I have known for a long time that China is the enemy. So far, the West has not seen that, but because of the coronavirus, the entire outlook of the world is changing. They're looking at China differently. And for sure, China is a very dangerous enemy. It's a very ruthless, intelligent enemy. Again, I've seen it with India, the way they play the carrot and stick. They will smile, they will act friendly, and the next moment they will, stab you in the back. I remember when the Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, who died now, went to China, invited by the Chinese, a lot of flowers. So the day he arrived in China, the Chinese did a nuclear test, just to remind Mr. Vajpayee, that they consider Indians inferior, and that they are the superior people. So I believe China is a dangerous enemy. And later I would like to speak about the role that India and Tibet. Tibet is so important. The Dalai Lama, who's now 84 years old, everybody ignores him. Nobody talks about the Dalai Lama. Nobody has received him officially, including Mr. Obama, I believe, or Mr. Trump, for that matter, in the last 20 years, because everybody's scared of China. But Tibet is so important at the moment, and nobody mentions it. It is so important. So later I will talk about that. Thank you, dear.
Francois, what you just said about Tibet, today being Sunday, the 24th of May, New York Times just ran a story about how China even selected the successor for Buddhism, different than the one that was selected by Dalai Lama. So, you're right. But, I just want to say to you, I don't think of China as an enemy, because I find, and like you, I like Chinese culture. I admire Confucius greatly. And there are many, many things in the great Chinese civilization that have been wonderful. It's the governance, and that goes back to David's point. It's the governance of how China is governed that is the problem. And really, in the world of governments, we either have democracy, we have autocracy, or frankly, at the complete extreme right, we have China. So my problem is in the competition world of governance, China is extreme in everything, because everything is governed. So it's not just the managed economy, even the thought is governed. In fact, President Xi's thought has now been constitutionalized in China's constitution. So you have to admire how well China does what it wants to do, even as we oppose what they want to do. Because if you don't see the music the way it's written, how do you get past it? How do you overcome it? And which is why, Matt Pottinger, the director in the National Security Council of the United States, recently gave a speech in Mandarin, and he was speaking to everyday Chinese to say to them, you need democracy, you need freedom of thought, you need freedoms. our Bill of Rights are really humanity's Bill of Rights. And so I think we have to compete with them on the issue of freedoms versus no freedom, because profit is not enough to compete on, because China has successfully harnessed profit and greed to actually enhance their own power. You have a lot of Chinese who are very wealthy. So profit has ended up becoming a horse that is running the chariot of the Chinese regime. So profit is not where we're going to be able to compete with China. They do it better. They have less cost, and they can manage their costs. They don't have hourly wages and all the other benefits. So I would say to you that all of us, and each one of us are opinion makers and opinion leaders. I would say to you that our role is to see China by connecting its dots, that from the moment of its birth, it came out as a warring nation that has succeeded beating the Imperial Army as part of World War II. Otherwise, from 1931 until 1940, it wasn't doing so well. But once it joined with the Allies, it came out fine. And because it came out as a warring nation, it went back to the Ming Dynasty from 1949. And if you start to connect those dots, they're there. You will see just 2 weeks ago, China made change of their maps. So now all those islands that are disputed with Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam and Japan and South Korea and so on, they're all now Chinese. On their maps, they have made them Chinese as a fiat, as a mandate. They've picked the fight on Ladakh. Okay, so while coronavirus has been exported by them, they're not only not sorry, they're even more belligerent. By diplomacy is the last thing that is belligerent. By definition, you cannot be a diplomat if you're belligerent. They instructed their Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the head. They instructed Minister Wang, Foreign Minister Wang, who I've met and spoken to, is a lovely, distinguished diplomat. But they instructed him to tell all the diplomats all over the world, Chinese diplomats, to become warrior wolves, which is amazing, to be belligerent. No diplomat is belligerent by definition. And if you are belligerent, you're no longer a diplomat. So there's an irony here. And
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. So Ravi, you mentioned about China is not an enemy. I think everybody is referring to China when they say, in this discussion and others, it's the Chinese government. So when we talk about North Korea, or when we talk about Venezuela or Cuba, right, or Iran as enemy or axis of evil or foe, that's referring to the government rather than the people. So I think everywhere the people are not it is the culprit.
I just wanted to protect the record for all of us. That's all.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So David.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
David.
No. Well, just to comment on that, the Chinese Communist Party is very different to the Chinese people and to the broader historical Chinese culture. I think we all understand that, and that probably goes without saying. But that said, just as I do recall that back in the 1930s, Hitler got a lot of praise for being able to make the railways run in time. He made them very efficient. That didn't stop us ultimately having to go to war with him, did it? So all I'm saying is that, and I'm not suggesting we go to war with China, because we would probably maybe not succeed, but we do have...
No, we would succeed now, but not 5 years from now.
Yeah, and that's the problem, Ravi, because as you say, it's so critical to understand that how China has actually, as you rightly point out, has taken these last couple of months when the coronavirus has swept the world and caused us so much problems. They've actually become even more hostile. Consider Australia. Australians, rightly so, wanted to ask some fundamental questions about the origins of coronavirus from that Wuhan virology lab. And of course, what have the Chinese done? They've become very aggressive and hostile to Australia for daring to even ask the question. So Ravi, you're right. They're exercising this wolf diplomacy, which is something that we're not used to, and we really have not been capable of handling. I mean, for many different reasons, I'm sure we could examine why have, as Arif said, why did we fall asleep for 20 to 30 years, maybe longer? Why have we slumbered?
Profit.
And woken up? Profit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our industries across the board, whether it's technology or garments or Chanel bags,
I
whatever,
disagree with you,
everything was
Ravi.
made in
I
China.
disagree with you. Let me say I disagree with you because there's a very interesting concept in India called the Asura. You must be familiar with that.
No,
that
what is that?
there are forces in the world, which are pro-evolutionary, which help humanity to evolve, and there are forces which are, anti-evolutionary, which think humanity. For sure, what China is unleashing on the world, whether it unleashed a coronavirus willingly, because we know that even if it did not come out of a Wuhan lab, the Chinese are making viruses, for war, to war against people, to war against humanity. They definitely are doing it. What came with the coronavirus is, dark forces of fear, panic, more than the coronavirus, more than the virus itself. In India, it killed 3,000-4,000 people, but more than virus, the panic, the fear, the denouncing the other people, the suspicion that we have to go to France, these are very dark forces. So you're talking about Confucius, but Confucius is dead. The Mao Zedong killed, all spirituality, including Buddhism in China.
Yes.
He
Yes.
killed a million. He killed a million Tibetans. I mean, let's not forget that. One of the most lovable people in the world. The Tibetans, one of the most peaceful, non-violent, which were a peaceful buffer between India and China, between two giants for centuries. They just, wiped them out. They wiped them out. They raised their temple. They burned their archives. I mean, there's a genocide. So I love Chinese, for what they do, but they are, they definitely are dangerous people. They are the enemy.
Francois,
Yeah.
Joseph Stalin.
Let's not go too much
Stalin,
into that.
Joseph Stalin, another one, one of these great leaders who did a lot of bad things, including Holodomor in Ukraine in the 1930s.
Yeah.
He made a very important comment. He says, when you kill one person, it's a tragedy. When you kill 1,000, it's a statistic. And that is unfortunately the rule that bad leaders follow all the time, because they know when they kill 100,000 or 1,000,000, it's too much to handle. And so China does that very well, the current government. But going back to what we were talking about and what Doreen wants to get to, which is WHO. Darren, let me just share with you that about a month ago, I proposed and I spoke to some foreign ministers of different countries, and they have endorsed my idea. And so I'm actually drafting a motion to amend the United Nations Charter to replace the WHO with a new kind of a United Nations Security Council, except my name, and it can change as it goes through the process. But my original name was World Pandemic Council, and that it should replace something called the Trusteeship Council, which is part of the UN Charter, because it's been mothballed and is not really in use. It's a great room, but it really doesn't do anything. And I have certain foreign ministers who already supported the idea, so I have to write that motion up. But I also just want to tell you, I had a direct conversation with Minister Wang a little over 3 years ago on this very issue of war. And at that time, there was no coronavirus. I was connecting the dots of what China has been doing since '49. And I was very troubled by their creating mischief reef from the ocean floor by pumping up the sand and building, a reef and then making a military base. Artificial islands, right. And they were competing with the American naval superiority by building land-based missile capability. And I said to him, what you're doing is really, really bad. And it's really inviting war. And it's either a little war now or a big war later. And I said, I prefer a little war now. And Minister Wang said to me, no war, no war. But of course, he's not the policymaker. He effectuates policy. A wonderful man, a distinguished diplomat. But, whether or not people who effectuate policy actually know the full extent of policy is always in doubt in any governance, in any government operation, and it's no different in China. So the foot soldier or a captain or a general or a foreign minister does not know what President Xi wants to do, all of it, because that's how governments run. So I want to come back and say to you, in terms of WHO has lost credibility. You cannot put, it's Humpty Dumpty, the egg is cracked, and David is right about the Director General, Dr. T. He's got to go, but the man is shameless. With all this activity on his head and all his bad deeds on it, and having injured the whole world, he's still there. The man's shameless. So he's got to go. And once he goes, the WHO can be recast, and perhaps recast to the point that it's, because public health is an important feature, isn't it? So I think it's as important as peace and security, which the United Nations Security Council delivers. So I think it should be at least of the same value, with permanent members and rotating members, and perhaps a bigger panel of rotating members and a bigger panel of permanent members. So that's a motion, as I said, I'm still working on. But these changes have to occur. And as opinion makers, and each one of you are important opinion makers, you've got to make the point very clear that what China is doing is not an accident. Okay, this is deliberate. They released coronavirus on purpose. They blocked Wuhan residents from coming across China, but they exported them all over the world. Okay, so they went into Japan, Hokkaido, where the capital city is Sapporo, the same name as the beer, and they gave coronavirus. They went to Sweden, they went to Europe, they went to Italy. And Arif's point about the garment industry, Milan is now mostly Chinese. I'm not racist in objecting, okay? But I love Italian fashions, okay? And if, China has overtaken Marco Polo and did him in reverse.
Yeah.
Thanks. So thanks, Ravi. And you talked about your suggestion for how to recast the new organization to take over from who, but and you also talked about you're very critical of China and calling it China being China is creating so much of problem across the world, etc. And you are a registered Democrat, and one of your you know where I'm going.
Go ahead.
And one of the lawmakers from Democratic Party recently, and I don't want to name the person, but recently came up with
Pramila? You mean Pramila Jayapal?
Yeah.
Okay,
Pramila
you
Jayapal.
should name her. She did a public tweet. It's public. There's no secret there.
It's public, yeah. She went public with a bill to name anybody who calls it a Chinese virus as racist. So how is that policy going to work?
Well, Pramila Jayapal is known for seeking personal advantage, even at the cost of our sovereignty, even at the cost of our national interest. So petty politicians do that, and she's a petty politician. But the fact is, I'm an American first. My political affiliation is secondary, and who I vote for depends upon who's on the ballot. So, it's not a given. If you're a sheep, whatever your label is, whatever you're branded, that's what you are. That's not true for anyone who's thinking. So the fact remains that China wants made in China, was very proud of that. And then when they finally created something that they were able to explode all over the world, like a neutron bomb, which leaves buildings alone but kills people. Well, that's what the Wuhan virus is. Okay, it came out of Wuhan. There's no doubt about it. It's made in China. Okay, that doesn't mean I like Chinese Americans any less. Grace Meng is a dear friend of ours. She's the first Chinese, one of the stars in Chinese American Congress members. Okay, dear friend, continues to be. Her husband is South Korean. It's fine. so we, thinking people can separate, so we're not going to do a concentration camp as we did in World War II for Japanese Americans. That's a sinful act that we did. We're not doing that here. So I have no problem saying I love Chinese Americans. I just don't like what China is doing.
But one of the things, if I can come in this, I mean, and Ravi, you've been very fair to acknowledge President Trump, despite the fact that your Democratic affiliations. Thank goodness for President Trump, because he has stood up against China, even though he was trying to do a deal with them and whatnot. But he's put America first, and I think the world first, by calling out the Chinese Communist Party, and in particular, he called it the China virus, because guess what? It came from China. It came from Wuhan. There's no debate on it. It's not racist. It's absolutely factual to do it. But one other thing I would add, and again, to pick up a point that's been made, and it's been talked about here in the UK. I mean, if you go into most of our stores, and I'm sure it's the same in many other countries, and you look at garments and such like, so much is made in China. We need to bring about a situation where there's a sense of shame in buying made in China. We want to buy things made in the UK. I guess you folks want to buy things made in India, made in the US. We need to bring back our national sovereignty in practical ways, a pride in buying produce, products, whatever it is, made in our countries, not made in communist China. And so there are lots of these little things which I think, if you do them individually, they can mean a lot, and they can change the face of the Chinese imperial advance across the world. And we do need to, we need to stop that and put it in retreat and get them out of our high streets, get them out of our shops, get them out of, guess what? I mean, you may have read this. China's building the new nuclear power plant in the UK. Well, what could possibly go wrong with that? China, China's Huawei, their telecoms company, Huawei. Sure. Huawei is seeking to integrate into UK 5G, which would completely compromise us as part of a global intelligence community, not least with our friends in the States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So, they spread their tendrils everywhere. And I agree, what Eric said earlier. They've done this systematically, and we must have known what they were doing, but we still let them do it. And for maybe different reasons. Francois says dark forces, maybe that's more than likely a fact, but also because of the profit motive. And also in my mind, because I'm a great opponent of globalism, I oppose globalism. This notion that you can have a supply chain around the world. We've seen under what's happened from coronavirus that when it came to it, globalism doesn't work. So yeah, lots of lessons to be learned from it. But the first one is we need to make each of our countries great again, and that means stop the reliance on communist China.
Yeah, thanks. And I was going to come on the globalization. You mentioned your opening remark also. Francois, if I can complete with David 1 minute.
No, actually, I wanted to talk because we talked a lot last time in the last discussion about Tedros and the WHO. Today, I wanted to talk about the realignment, about the realignment of power, of nations, of alliances, political alliances, military alliances in the world. So
yes.
Whenever you're ready.
So, Francois, we have the second segment dedicated on that. So let's talk about that. We'll close this segment. We are running out of time for this first segment. But David, you did mention about, briefly about you are not for globalization.
I'm against it. I'm against it. 100%, unambiguously against it.
And globalization was started by Western country mainly to get maybe market access across. Do you think it has gone to extreme? In fact, while they got advantage initially, now they are losing because of the same principles that was working for them earlier.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And again, I mean, Eric's right in what he said, that yes, we've exploited China, if you like, to get access to their market and still do, but they've got access to the entire world. it's not been an equal relationship. They've been much more clever than us. They have got their tendrils into all our economies to different scales, different degrees. So globalization, I think, which was very much the vogue political narrative for the last 20 years or so, I think at least, I think has been demonstrated to be an absolute failure. Not only that, but dangerous, as we've seen, very dangerous, lethal under coronavirus. And there'll be other such scenarios come along. So that's why the realignment has to be to move away from this kind of, this one big world and we're all friends together, which is just naive. And I'm sure Ravi would agree that,
I do agree. I agree.
It'd be lovely if it was like that. It's not. So we have to deal with the real world and real people.
Unless everybody follows the same rules, you cannot have. Everybody has to follow the same rules.
Yeah.
Same rules with respect to the labor conditions. Same rule with respect to the democracies, law of the land, etc. Then only you can have a level playing field. And unless you have level playing field, this doesn't really work. Globalization or trade, where the level playing field is so skewed.
Yep.
By the way, the rule of law is a interesting phrase because it's actually a black hole. What rule of law means in the United States or in the UK is not what it means in China. Okay.
Agreed. So before we end this segment, Arif, coming back to you, you initially alluded, right, and mentioned, and very rightfully, that China has far many votes in the UN and other bodies, but that's not the advantage the other countries have. So Arif, do you want to just extend what you are talking about, China having so much of control over the United Nations, and through that extension over the WHO and other organizations?
Well, yes, but coming to that point, before coming to that point, I would like to ask one question. That if Ravi is racist because he is calling a Chinese virus Chinese, then aren't we racist when we call Spanish flu? What is wrong with Spain?
We discussed last time.
Because Spain is not offended.
Chinese virus Chinese. Well done, Ravi.
We discussed that last time, Arif. We discussed that last time in our last program. So, But going back to your point,
WHO. That yes, we have now. There has to be a system. That how would you balance the power structure of this organization? Because a goon country, because Chinese government, as Ravi said, that China and China's culture, China's people are very good, but it is the government. I have to face this in my life also, because whenever I speak about human rights violations in Pakistan, they say you are talking against your own country. And I say, no, I love my country. I'm not speaking against my country. I'm speaking about an oppressive army ruling the country since 1947. I'm speaking about the governance, as Ravi said. So in WHO also, we have to see how you can govern the body. Because how there can be a system, a mechanism that a country, when we talk about what, we have to talk about the contribution also. Because a country of a small size, 50 million people in New Zealand is paying more than a country which has maybe 300 million population or 500 million population. So there has to be, and I'm not agreeing with a new body, because it has already thousands of employment, system, structure, infrastructure. So in spite of thinking of a new body, there is a reformation of the WHO is very important. And for that, I think that it will be a very tough job, because agreeing on points between especially the superpowers. And of course, I think that we will speak more on this in the next segment, because now it comes to the alliance also, because to reform United Nations, WHO and these bodies, the future alliances will play the major role.
Before, Dhiren, you go off, I just wanted to comment back to Arif. I wanted to just make an observation that, you know, I understand your concerns and you have the right as a Pakistani to say whatever you like about Pakistan. But I would just say to you that Pakistan has been a loyal ally of the United States for 50 years during the Cold War. And that
I don't
created,
have
and
the
you know, it was a
Straying
loyal
away from
buffer
the
ally.
discussion.
No,
lot.
listen.
They are,
You
they
know,
are not honest.
little shoplifting doesn't close a store, okay? So it doesn't matter about little things that go wrong. So, but in a major way, Pakistan was a loyal ally of the United States during the Cold War, and it caused its own consequences. And secondly, because of the internal political structure of Pakistan, which was not as strong for whatever reason, and I'm no expert on it, it was the Pakistani army that kept the Pakistani sovereignty intact. So
Yeah.
there are good
You're
things
going
and there
away
are
from
bad.
the discussion,
So,
and
we'll
you're
disagree.
going away from the discussion because
Today we are not talking about Pakistan. Today we are not
9
talking about
p.m. for me here. It's
yeah.
9 p.m. for me here.
But I don't agree at all. Today we are not talking about Pakistan. So let's end this segment. Thank you so much, and we'll come back to the next segment. So welcome viewers to our second segment. We have taken far longer in our first segment, and that's how we are kind of not a very structured where we'll allocate specific time. We let the panelists, you know, share their perspective, and it has taken much more longer time in the first segment. So we are going to cut down this segment significantly. We'll just highlight the need for the new alliances and, you know, diminish relevance of the existing alliance, and we'll have a full program on this new alliance needs for that and what it should look like in our subsequent program. So coming to you, Francois, you wanted to discuss about the new alliances and need for that. So please share your perspective, but let's keep it short and we'll have a full program on a new alliance and how the world would look like from the alliance perspective.
The need of the hour for the West, for the West and Japan and a few other nations is to contain China. Now, I mean, unless you have a war, which I don't think will happen at the moment. So how to contain China? There is only one country that can be used by United States particularly and some of the European countries to contain China. It is India, because India has a 4,000 kilometers border with China. India has a manpower. India has the army. India has the willpower. India is a democracy. So the alliance that we're going to see, that I would like to see in the next future, the next months or next few years, is that India is used as a buffer to contain the Chinese search for hegemony, for eating up other nations, Hong Kong and Taiwan and Arunachal Pradesh in India. I know, and building a Silk Road, through the Himalayas, down to Pakistan, and then pouring all the goods into the West. So to contain China, which to me seems very important, India and Tibet are the nations that are naturally, from a geographic position, from a historical position, are those that the West should use to contain China. That's all I wanted to say for the moment.
Just as a quick response, Francois, the Romans built roads of cobblestone all over the then Roman known world. And some of them were even in England. And today, the Britishers use those Roman-laid roads. So China's OBOR may end up being used and controlled by countries other than China as time moves on.
I don't believe it. But
well, I think that the Communist Party will ultimately, if we do it right, the Communist Party will lose the Chinese people.
If there is
and
a
that's how we
revolution in
take over.
China, if there is a revolution in China, because this is bound to happen. Tibet always found its freedom whenever there was social unrest in China. So if there is a revolution in China because of Tibet, because of the 1 million Muslims that have been put into camp, because of people in China wanting freedom of expression, people in China wanting to know who's accountable for the virus, for the coronavirus. If there is a revolution, yeah, maybe that role will be used by everybody. But at the moment, I think the Chinese want to use it solely for their own purpose.
I agree with your assessment. I'm just wishing for a Chinese Gorbachev. There was a chairman, Deng Xiaoping. I'm looking for a Chinese Gorbachev who understands that the walls need to come down.
But when it came to power, when he came to power, Russia was already declining force. So it also, there are many other forces that play apart from who is heading there.
Well,
Right.
if I can just come in this one, Ravi mentioned the fact that the Romans built roads in England, and that's true, they did. And those roads actually still exist in one form or another. But what happened to the Romans, the Roman Empire in England? Well, I'll tell you what happened. The Romans overextended, and we chased them out. That's why the Romans were chased across the Channel back into continental Europe. So,
Yes.
so the moral of the story is, I guess, all empires tend to overextend. It's kind of what they do. So this is where it comes back to what we have been discussing throughout this in terms of what are the things we can do. Francois made some very good points there, which I would actually agree with in terms of how we can contain China, what other things Ravi's talked about we can do to also handle China, because we've not seen anything like China for a long time. So these are all lessons that I think we have to internalize at nation level, but then work with each other. I do believe India, Francois, will be absolutely crucial going forward. But I also think the United States, Ravi, and how it manages things in this next short period of time, the next couple of years, is crucial as well. The international organizations are also important. So all these dimensions have to be considered. But the final punchline is the Roman Empire ruled a big chunk of the world. It fell, and that gives me hope, because one day, let's hope the China Communist Party empire will also fall.
But I don't want to wait for 500 years. I don't want to wait for 500 years, David.
I'm with you on that one. I'm with you, Ravi.
I want to stop this empire now.
So,
okay.
so
And by the way, Trump is doing exactly correctly. Okay. He's doing exactly what needs to be done. He's standing up with a backbone of steel. And actually, China's made the biggest miscalculation other than coronavirus, which is they've created a perfect storm in the United States by being belligerent instead of apologetic. Okay, and our domestic politics with the presidential election, each one has to prove they're not a Manchurian candidate. Manchuria is in China. So this is actually makes American response and resolve stronger, thanks to China's belligerence.
So I will just make this closing remark. And so what we are discussing now, right, comparison with Roman Empire or so, I think the world that time, maybe few hundred centuries back, was not as interconnected, and obviously the power was not that much military wise that it could destroy any country, could destroy entire humankind. Today, with the nuclear arm and other arms, right, we cannot go to war like that, and that's why the alliance is extremely important. How do you contain a country today? It is more important the economic power than just the military power. And the military is important, obviously, for economic power as well. But how do you contain countries through economic power and more globalized response? While we, David did mention that globalization, but I think we need some kind of globalization to respond to threats like China. So we'll talk about that in our next segment, in our next program, specifically talking about what the world should look like from the alliance standpoint and how different countries that believe in democracy. China doesn't believe in democracy, and that's why they're able to do what they are doing, because they don't have to worry about the election, right? And they can do 20 years, 25 years plan as we discussed. So we'll talk about the new alliances and need for strengthening new alliances, like Francois mentioned, like Quad is coming up, etc. NATO was an alliance to deal with Russia. How if and it did do good job. Today maybe it's not relevant because the threat has changed. So in our next program we'll talk about the new alliances. And with that, I think we'll end this program. Anybody has a last comment to make? Otherwise, we'll end this program.
I just like to thank all my fellow panelists. Thank you very much. I've learned so much listening to you, and I hope whoever's watching this also has found this to be a helpful and interesting discussion.
Thank you, Dhiren, for initiating that. Thank you, Dhiren.
Thank you, Dhiren. It's time for a drink.
Thank you, Mehtaji. And it was so learning process for me.
Thank
you so much.